Hello? Hello? I feel like I need Michelle's voice distortion. Yes. Hello, everyone. Hi. Well, thank you so much for coming here today, and also thank you so much for participating in the symposium. We had 6 very different performances, from presentations to animations to interactive exercises to like another staged choreographed what do we call it, performance, to a meditation exercise. So I wanted to start by talking about yes, maybe. No, I wanted to start by introducing everyone. Yeah. So today we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 very different groups here. It's okay, you can stay here. So let me start by introducing Michael Wang. Michael Wang is an artist, but he's actually trained as an architect, and his work uses global systems as a medium for art. And a lot of his work questions ecology, distinction, and other concepts of nature in general. And then we have Aidan Ackerman. Aidan teaches at SUNY ESF. He's trained as a landscape architect, but his focus and research now is on visualization and simulation on about forest and plant growth. And then we have Tim Simons. Tim is an artist who also studies architecture and performance studies. His practice deals with forms of care and pedagogy, and he creates artwork, sculptures and performances with plants, and also with different types of organic processes. And lastly, we have Michelle and Larissa. They're nocturnal medicine. Both of them are also trained as landscape architects, but now they're practicing as a collective, throwing events, performances, and different forms of cultural engagement to question how we approach very difficult larger-than-life questions such as climate crisis and distinction.
Hello. Oh.
Hi.
Can you introduce yourself also?
Yes, and lastly, my name is Lily Wong. I'm the Boghosian Fellow at the School of Architecture this year, and my research is about the production of plants, specifically tropical and semi-tropical plants, and their socio-political, environmental, and also spatial dimensions. So I wanted to bring all these people together from very different fields and engagement to have a conversation about how we interact with plants and what new forms of human-plant interactions are possible.
So both Lily and I, Tim or Timmy, we're going to bounce a couple questions off each other and off each other and off each other. So we'll kind of grow in that way. I think maybe as a place to start, though, because you already mentioned in terms of your research, it's just bizarre to look at my voice emerging on the screen, so I'm going to do like this. Since you just mentioned in your research the focus and place that plants have had, I'm curious to go back to how you started us off today, or some of us that were there, with the word pet. And if you could just sort of reframe what is a kind of internal question for you and has been for your students that were in class with you around this idea of pet. Why pet plant?
So what is a pet plant? So this is a kind of a word that I made up. I use the word pet specifically because when you think about your pets, like your puppy, your cat, you don't think about them as something that produces utility, or you don't own, or you don't keep them because they are of service to you, but you have pets because you care for them, they're your family. It's a very different form of engagement. Also, pets have rights, animal rights, and now it's a normalized thing to talk about. But how about plants? When we talk about plants, I think even now in architecture school, a lot of us think about plants as just green stuff in the background, or just a cat block, a Photoshop image that they just place inside or outside a building. But really, what does it mean to have plants as part of the design process, as part of the environments that you create? How do you actually engage with those plants, not just as decorations, or not just as food or building material, but actually as a natural entity that has its own merit, has its own right to be part of our world. So that's why I use the word pet to point to those interactions and activities that we actually do that is different than just extracting things from plants.
Great, that's helpful. I mean, that definition, I think some of the things that I click on too are thinking about productive versus non-productive value, and how we measure something culturally in terms of that. And also this, I mean, I think a question that kind of went throughout in certain ways is, particularly in the performance that you did with your students, what happens when we position a structure of thinking, a structure of constructing, a structure of legalizing, a structure of owning onto other kinds of species? And how does that, be that like an agricultural like expectation for productivity from plants versus a photosynthesis, or be that some other, like a pattern, right? As your class did together. But I'll get back to that in a second. The thing that it really reminded me of is this quote that I've had on my mind that I'd love to read, which is from an essay of Audre Lorde's in the late 70s, I think, called "The Uses of the Erotic." The erotic as a form of power, where she's sort of repositioning the term, the idea of the erotic, as something that has been sort of suppressed and quieted by, what would be called, I guess, in some other way, phallologocentrism, or a male power, and a male way of thinking about knowledge. And she sort of plays with this idea of the erotic as something that is involved in the doing rather than the things that are done, or trying to see the erotic as something that we could reclaim as a kind of, as she calls, this sort of yellow kernel in old packets of margarine that actually colored the rest of the margarine and actually gave it pleasure. And something also that we share and do communally. I'm just going to read the quote because it is quite provocative to me, and then I'll sort of say why. She writes, "Understanding is a handmaiden that can only wait upon or clarify that knowledge deeply born. And the erotic is the nurturer or nursemaid of all our deepest knowledge." that might be a little bit of a twist of things, but she's positioning at least two different kinds of knowledge against each other. One that we might associate with the erotic, and then the other that we maybe don't yet associate with the erotic, and one that we associate with the Enlightenment or categorization and these other things. So I thought maybe as a way of hearing everybody else's voice, I'm curious how, because I think it came up again and again, how for each of you, or you collectively, you see multiple forms of knowledge, or multiple forms of power, or multiple forms of value systems that are sort of integral to your work. I mean, maybe to start in the most obvious, clear, already verbalized way, with Michael Wang's work, we're dealing with a manifesto that's speaking about a different validative system. So maybe we can start there and then kind of move around.
Sure.
You can also reject my question.
No, I think it's very interesting. I'm just trying to think where to start. I mean, maybe one kind of place to start is the kind of very premise of the manifesto as an inversion is based on something actually very scientific, which would be just sort of understanding metabolic processes as like a set of potentially reversible chemical equations. So to think of modern energy as just expending carbon, producing CO2, and then kind of reversing that and looking at how photosynthesis captures carbon and creates sugar and oxygen. So that's something that's very much coming from like the domain of science in terms of like a sphere of knowledge. And kind of incredibly this kind of rational enlightenment logic that you're describing. But then I think I'm using that to inform a new way of thinking about aesthetic valuation that I think really can then exceed that formula. It's using the formula as sort of a jumping off point to turn around, but then to kind of look at the sort of incredible richness of the effects of that turn. And maybe that's where something like logic and pleasure potentially can kind of intersect and kind of coexist.
I really love this question. In our work, we're talking about issues like climate change, extinction, these sort of larger than life changes that we're facing in the planet. And we know that there are limits to how we're able to process this information because of the scale of immensity of these issues. So in nocturnal medicine, one of our key principles is how can you lead people to open themselves up to some of these issues in ways that are rooted in a sensory experience, in ways that open you up to pleasure, in ways that are sensual, in ways that ask you to touch something or taste something or be bathed in sound. Could that help people, inspire people, seduce people into confronting and reckoning questions and issues that are really, really painful and hard to get close to? So pleasure and sensuality, these are tools that we have that can bring people closer to things that we otherwise want to avoid.
That's great. Aidan, before we turn to maybe something that could sort of transition over in some ways, because I think you're just touching on it, was sort of part of my sort of follow-up to this question is, for me personally, I think a lot about, in scenarios where we might learn metonymically or metaphorically from something else, or that we might be inspired in some ways by other forms of life. I love this word tool because it kind of helps to get out of the bind of being anthropocentric for me. And so I'm kind of curious, as maybe also a way of thinking about in your work that's so focused on simulation, but I think in a way that I've never heard anybody else speak about, like simulation as a form of life in a certain way, that question is sort of key also, right?
Right. I think in terms of a value system or a parallel to the erotic, I think of like the same experience you have when you are enamored with anything, like a desire to possess, know, be as close to, and in some cases, really own that thing. So when I think about the paradox of the practice of landscape architecture, and some of what I try to get at in the work I showed is that, so landscape architects fundamentally want to make nature into something that's human oriented, not exclusively, but that's one of the pieces of it. Like, it's designed for people. So domesticating, coming up with new cultivars, planning for all the scenarios that will make these plants be happy so that the long-term maintenance is successful. I'd like to think about it, so for architecture students and architects, I think generally my sense of it is that the sort of service life or serviceability of the parts of the building, how long something will last for, what's needed to maintain it, when it's time to put a new roof on the building. And yet with a plant or like a tree on the street, we would never remove it before it was showing signs of distress. We don't have that same command and ability to know everything about a plant. But we design as though we do, and that's sort of the way that we operate, because in some ways I think it's an inheritance of the architectural frame of working, but in other ways it's just a human professional way of wanting to plan ahead and create something that's successful. And so in my own work, it's trying to get these feelings, again, very erotic, this feeling like of awe, connection, being within and as close to this phenomenon. And yet that same paradox of like, we'll never be able to fully capture and show it and know it, but we're gonna keep trying, is almost like that chase of someone else or some other thing, and that sort of intoxication of trying to get there. That's how I feel in my own work. It's kind of suspension of time and an intoxication with trying to get closer, more accurate, more beautiful, that I think connects very much to whether it's the act of doing something, and it does feel like it's trying to create something. There can be almost like a feeling of like, it's like very easy to feel like you have command and you're almost like godlike. I've made this natural system. That's really kind of a really fun way to work, but it's not very humbling, right? The humbling part for me comes when the experts have a lot to say about that, So I would say, this goes a little bit off course, but the feedback from other people who have other frames of looking at these scenarios is super important to not just continue to perpetuate more and more of what I'm doing without that check of people who really have spent their lifetime trying to understand these systems and still don't.
Maybe, I don't know which of Lily's students are still here, but maybe there's a student that wants to respond on your all part, or Lily, you can, but I think it might be nice.
Yeah, does anyone have a question or comments? It doesn't have to be about plans. It could be about the performance, the meditation, words we use,
Of your
aesthetics.
students? Are your students here? Our average age went up.
Yeah, some of them are here. Yeah.
Sorry. Why don't you start us off, and then maybe somebody can say you're wrong. Yeah. Oh, great. Yeah.
Maybe I can ask a question to everyone here. I realized that it has been kind of a common theme or a medium that all of you guys explore, which is this idea of voice and language. I wanted to maybe ask you guys to talk a little bit about how using language, whether it's kind of this distorted voice or it's quite literally kind of Tim narrating and instructing all of us, have been shaping your work as well as kind of helping you to think about your kind of concepts and ideas.
Maybe I can start because the performance that I did with my class, the script is the text in the plant pattern. We are reading the pattern in the whole performance, and I'm actually interested in a legal document as a performative script, not in the sense, not only in the sense that it makes claim that changes behavior or conceptions of different things, but also as a way to create legal subjects. So in the class we argue that in the plant pattern there are two subjects. One is the pattern itself, the US Plant Patent Office that basically set up a series of questions that the applicant has to reply to, like what is your species name? And there's a very formulaic way to claim that what you're so-called inventing is actually completely novel, that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. So a lot of the language within the plant pattern is about comparing, oh, this species or this hybrid is similar to what we are doing, but we are so different, and that lay claims to a completely new so-called invention. That is the definition of an invention in a legal sense. So, and the other person would be the inventor of the plant, Larian Gardner. She also has a voice in the performance. So those are the thinking behind that particular performance.
I want to just react to that for a second and then let somebody else answer the same question. But I already mentioned this to you. There's a beautiful piece of writing by Jamaica Kincaid called In History. And it sort of oscillates between her describing Antigua, where she's from, her standing in her garden in Vermont, and talking about the history of botany. Carl Linnaeus, who's like the sort of, inventor of this kind of nomenclature, as far as I understand. But she also traces his name, Carl Linnaeus, from the linden tree. And so, or maybe the linden tree was named after Carl Linnaeus, I can't remember exactly the thing. But there's all these entwinements of proprietary things. And yeah, I find that really sort of interesting in terms of like this endless, the difference between our sort of actual and maybe very place-specific interaction with something, like the people that lived on Antigua before it was called a Portuguese or Spanish name, Antigua, and the nomenclature or the Latinate name, and all these other the sort of exhaustive voices that are like trying to define this thing so that it can be property, right?
Right. Yeah. And I love those so-called botanical knowledge from the Enlightenment is about extracting the plants into specific parts and then made up words to describe them. There's a taxonomy about different types of leaves and stems and root systems. But I wanted to ask Michelle and Larissa about the voice that you use in your performance.
Yeah, I think that voice in particular, there's something identityless about it. It's kind of very hard to place it as belonging to a specific kind of person or a kind of body. And I think that is what draws us to it, and I think in a way it allows us to absent ourselves from the speaking of the work, and it allows, I think, the listener to also absent us from it, and to kind of sort of dream into that voice whatever kind of like force or phenomena or mystery or feeling might reach them or feel palpable or accessible. Yeah. Do you have anything else?
You want to talk about the voice? You want to talk about? I would love to answer. Yeah,
Go ahead.
I would love to answer about the voice, and maybe deflect and talking and asking others about the voice. But I have done a lot of work and thinking about what's a teaching voice, and in all of its moral ambiguities, and but I was just thinking about it in contrast to, well, actually from the first question I asked, I was like, I was all of a sudden be like, what if somebody asks me this? And I was like, well, maybe two forms of knowledge that I think about are knowledge as informational and knowledge as a transference of agency, which is maybe more entwined with teaching. And I really like thinking of language in that way as kind of gift-giving, if you think about, or a voice, right? As kind of gift-giving, that I'm losing something. I'm losing control over something that I seem to have ownership over, which is a thought that I express in a voice, and I'm giving it to somebody else for them to control in their way. And if you're really, really trying to control it, you end up with this, 30 minutes of trying to control it, right? In a in a legal way, in a proprietary way. So I think in some ways that's how I think about the voice. But in other ways, in other ways I think of the voice as a kind of a metonymic representation of many other things. Yeah. I'm curious about the voice. Sorry, I'm curious about the voice in terms of the reading that we heard, and what the idea was for you in creating this moment of a communal voice or an aggregate voice out of other people that were reading.
I mean, the manifesto itself is a text, and I guess a text is kind of like the first viral medium, like print. And some way I want the manifesto to be viral, to be something that can spread, can kind of infect others in their thinking. And I think that reading it aloud is one way of sort of activating it in a kind of more social sense. Maybe I like the idea that everyone gets to take a little bit of ownership of the part they read. Somehow giving it this kind of active but kind of ongoing kind of spreading life, I guess.
Great. Sam, you wanted to ask something?
Thank you. Yes, I've been trying to think all day about the ways in which your different performances drew the rhetoric of climate change away from something punitive, which is usually how we're engaged in. There's an urgency, we need to act. It is upon us as agents to do something. I found in the different performances, perhaps Lily's, and then this morning cooking sections, something statistics as poetry, in a sense, the shape of statistics. Then in Michael's and in Timmy's, and in Aiden's, a sense of reversibility, almost like a Benjamin Button kind of story that you tell. So climate change as a narrative, something that can go back and forth. And then finally in nocturnal medicine and in Timmy's a sense of an underbelly that you create, a soft sensory underbelly. I'm thinking of the earth on the platform of the shrine on the one hand, and then the water that holds the discolored parsley, which I would like to ask a question also about your use or disuse of color, and how you made that be that which is absent in your performance. And so I'm curious for any and all of you. I think you have expressed what it means for a rhetoric of climate change to be given as a gift to someone in a way that is not punitive, or that does not convey an urgency that is upon the beholder to do something about. But
just to bring
the color.
something in that we haven't spoken about, like the cooking sections, like not punitive in the sense like not a monetized tree.
Yes.
Right? Not a Bloomberg tree. Or a Berg bloom, as we can call it. Right?
That's okay. It's good. Well, so I think you did a really great job of binding all of the performances together in a really eloquent way, first of all, of finding something. You sort of hit upon an essence of each of them. I'll speak to my own work. First, I should say, I participate fully in the commodification of climate goals and political state targets by 2050, and much of my work is funded by agencies that want to advance messages about how to act in this way, not this way, to hit these goals and reach these audiences and these landowners. And the first time somebody who's more of a landscape artist, they weren't diminishing it, but they said that it was very commodified, which it absolutely is. So I think some of the work that I do in virtual reality, and really just, it's actually sort of where I find my own pleasure in this, is in sort of celebrating the plant. And so just by really trying to get close to it and trying to learn more about it, part of that diverts into videos, for example, for forest foundations. And part of it becomes my own work, and it's very private and personal. What I was so grateful for, and why I think some of this type of symposia that isn't just an academic conference presentation, is to giving space to think a little bit more deeply about why am I doing this, right? As somebody who's needs to get tenure, like there's certain things you have to do if that's your goal to make your work have impact. But at the end of the day, like there's something at the core that I really value. And so I want to thank Lily for the opportunity to just spend time with that. It's incredibly valuable to have these moments.
Yeah, I also wanted to mention that I think when we always, in school we always try to imagine an alternative or new ways to do things, and I think a lot of these aspirations have to be somehow represented, or figure out new ways to actually enact and put that out into the world. And I think maybe the the nice thing about the format of a performance is a time-based media and also allows us to actually, in a way, figuring out exactly how to present those information, our research, but also different possibilities that we envision with botanical objects.
Maybe one of the things I was trying to respond to and kind of react against is conversations around art and climate change, say, that sort of focus on kind of dialing back art's impact, the sort of like responsibility of artwork, say, in kind of excessive use of materials and energy, and kind of being, looking at artworks that have huge carbon footprints, or art fairs where people fly around around the world to attend. So much of the conversations around climate seem to focus on those aspects of sort of like reduction, kind of how to do less damage. And so I kind of wanted to do something quite different, which was to envision how art making could be something of kind of with an increasing kind of like richness, something. Yeah, so I think in the text it says that it's sort of countering a certain kind of asceticism associated with sort of climate consciousness. So yeah, it was something I was really trying to do very actively, is just to kind of give another vision for what it might mean to be carbon negative, but in a positive way.
The environmental movement has used guilt and shame to try to motivate people to join the movement since its onset. And if you're a human who has ever experienced the feeling of shame, then you know that it's not effective. It makes you shut down, it makes you turn away, it makes you feel bad. So I'm really excited by the fact that this group of people is approaching it in a new way, in a different way, because we actually really need that. Because when you point your finger at someone and you say, this is your fault and you better change something now, it's not going to elicit a good reaction. So I think what is effective, though, is leading people to a real sense of emotion about what's happening. And it opens up into this bigger issue we have of our emotional disconnect from the natural world, our emotional disconnect from climate change. So I think, at least speaking for our work, a lot of what we're trying to do is to create an opportunity, create a context, create a series of rituals that can kind of lead someone down their own personal journey of arriving at a place of authentic emotion about what is happening. Often that emotion is sadness. We cite a lot an essay by Timothy Morton called Guilt, Shame, and Sadness, where they speak to this very thing, this very issue, and how potent sadness is. So that's what motivates our work. We just want to make you feel sad and very relaxed, and also in a place of pleasure, and say, what can emerge out of this cocktail of emotions when you remove the shame.
Is it happening? It's happening? Okay. That sounds very, reminds me also of how I think Aidan was framing your work in terms of simulation as, something that is part of an erotic realm, but also can like stimulate a kind of mourning, right? By seeing things in reverse, seeing things that are harder to imagine, or even seeing things kind of as you expect them to be, in some ways. I think it's interesting how like empathy plays a part in it, right? Like how does empathy emerge, and when is it sincere, and when is it not? I mean, for me personally, I guess a way into it for me is I'm I'm interested in how like non-linear it is, and the expectations, I think, from culture in many ways of how linear it should be to have progress in some ways, to have environmental, you know, alleviation or something. But that personally comes from me, from thinking about like forms of altruism that are very complicated and confusing, and that could be within very capitalist ventures or outside of it in forms of nurturing. So I think that's because I think if you see like a very direct, I don't know if I'm going to agree with this after I say it, but I think if you approach the questions with a moral compass, sometimes it's harder to see the complexity of them. And we were talking about this yesterday, like for me, making art, you can make artwork that doesn't have a moral compass, even if you personally do have a moral compass. And I think that might be a much more productive way of questioning certain things.
I want to say something that I think kind of weaves together a bit of what you just said about getting outside of a moral compass, and also something that Michael's work talks about, which is the invocation of deep time as this kind of antidote or balm to like excessive production, constant production, which I think is also linked to like a sense of anxiety and urgency that can come along when we try to think about how we'll fix climate change, but we're like still in this like really sort of like psychotically generative mindset when we're trying to like figure out how to fix it. And I think that when we kind of touch into an awareness of deep time and remind ourselves that the earth, the universe, is like millions and millions and millions of years old and changes slowly but also constantly, we can kind of escape for a moment from this anxiety and this urgency, and enter into a place that is a bit more complex, that is more morally complex, in a sense, almost detached in a way from some of the pain of what's happening. And I think that it can help to lead us into a sort of state where we can simultaneously be in that sort of grounded, calm, slow-moving awareness, but at the same time hold the knowledge that there is an immense amount of pain, there is an immense amount of suffering, and we do need to act on that.
Can I open it up again to whoever else is here? If you'd like to ask a question, you can raise your hand at any point. I don't know how much time we have. We don't have any time. Should I end it? You have a question. You have a question, and I'm going to end it after your... I mean, somebody will respond, I promise.
I just have a quick question to Michelle, your comment earlier in terms of guilt and shame. I can see how it can be somewhat unproductive, but I wonder if at some point it still becomes somewhat necessary as somewhat of an initiator or a kind of almost like a stimulus.
Is guilt necessary? Is shame necessary? I think those emotions make us stuck. I think they're stopping points. I think shame in particular is an emotion that kind of makes you want to not be seen anymore and makes you want to disappear. Whereas sadness or empathy or some of these other things, I think can be opening and can make you want to move towards something and can make you want to change something about yourself or about the world, because then you're activated, you're alive. But I do feel that shame is an emotion that just prompts shut down. And I think that a lot of the world is in a state of shut down shame. So no, I don't think it's necessary. I think we should banish it. Everybody is absolved, almost everybody. And I think we need to move towards a different set of emotions if we want to be accountable and to move through this.
I'm going to be the quick penultimate voice before Lily and just close things up on that. Yesterday, when some of us met, Michael and I were talking about a teacher that was really important to him, Jose Munoz, and it was a name that I've heard many times. And then I was last night looking up a little bit around his work, and in the obituary there was he passed away in 2012, is that right? I think, yeah. In the obituary there was a very moving quotation that I was also thinking about today. It's about communal mourning, and it's a sort of distinction of other forms of mourning, not mourning like sunrise, but the other kind of mourning. Communal mourning from other forms of mourning. The quote is, we do not just mourn we do not just mourn one lost object or other, but we also mourn as a whole, a contingent and temporary collection of fragments that experiences a loss of its part. One loss of its parts. Maybe that's a dark place to end, but I think it's also kind of a wonderful way of thinking about the predicament of these things that we've been talking about that are both limited and not limited, and both connected to us and not connected to us. Yeah.
But also the realization of the possibility of loss also make us want to care for things, right? So maybe that's a more optimistic note. But really thank you everyone for coming, and also thank you for such a wonderful day, being here, from 12 to now to 6:30 with us. I really appreciate all of your inputs and our conversation, and I look forward to continuing this conversation in the future. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks
Lily.
for coming.